back in August 2024, the skies over Ukraine started to look a little different. That's when American-made F-16 fighter jets finally touched down, giving Ukraine something it hadn't really had before: aircraft powerful enough to stand toe-to-toe with Russia's relentless missile and drone attacks. Now, to be clear, these jets weren't some kind of magic solution that flipped the war overnight. But they gave Ukraine new tools, new choices, and that alone started to shift the energy of the battlefield. As more of these F-16 arrived, Ukraine grew bolder. At first, the focus was defense, shielding cities and infrastructure from incoming fire. But soon, Ukrainian pilots were using the jets for offense too, launching strikes against Russian positions and forcing Moscow to rethink its moves. Everyone knew what this meant. Western aircraft had entered the fight, and that spelled real trouble for Russian forces dug into Ukrainian territory. But just as Russia was adjusting to the F-16 threat, word came that something even more unnerving was on the horizon. This time, the news wasn't from the United States. It was from Sweden. The Saab JAS-39 Gripen, a nimble, modern fighter jet designed specifically to counter threats like Russia, was about to make its debut in Ukraine's skies. For Vladimir Putin, this was no small problem. The Gripen wasn't just another jet. It was built to be deadly efficient, cheaper to run than many Western planes, and perfectly suited for Ukraine's style of warfare. On September 29th, the Kyiv Post dropped the bombshell. Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Lieutenant General Ivan Havrilyuk, confirmed that Gripens would soon be joining the fight. He didn't shout it from the rooftops or hold some big press event. Instead, he let the news slip almost casually during an interview, responding to careful questions from a BBC Ukrainian journalist. The reporter pressed him on the details everyone wanted to know. When will the new jets arrive? How many are coming? Havrilyuk smiled and dodged. His answer? Something along the lines of, "Well, when you see them flying over Ukraine, then you'll know." It was a sly response, the kind of answer that says a lot by saying very little. The message was clear. Ukraine wasn't going to hand Russia a playbook. The less Moscow knew, the harder it would be to prepare countermeasures. After all, surprise can be as powerful a weapon as any missile or jet engine. The BBC journalist, though, wasn't ready to let the conversation slide. After Havrilyuk hinted that new fighter jets were on the way, the reporter leaned in and asked a sharper question. By expected, do you mean F-16S, the French-made Mirage, Sweden's Gripen, or maybe in the best-case scenario, all of them? Havrilyuk didn't deny it. In fact, his answer made things even more intriguing. He simply said, "You've named the nomenclature correctly, but I won't go into detail about when, what, or which one." It sounded like a dodge, but Ukrainian outlets like the Kyiv Post jumped on those words. If the reporter's list was correct, then Havrilyuk had essentially confirmed it without saying it outright. The Gripen was definitely part of the package. That one subtle phrase, named the nomenclature correctly, was all the hint people needed. For many, it was as good as a green light. Swedish fighter jets were finally heading to Ukraine. But this wasn't happening overnight. The road to Gripens in Ukraine had actually been winding and complicated. You might think Sweden was reluctant to hand them over. But surprisingly, the opposite was true. Back in early 2024, Sweden had already offered its Gripen jets. It was Ukraine that said no at the time. Why turn down advanced fighter jets in the middle of a brutal war? The answer wasn't politics or preference, it was practicality. Around that same time, Ukraine was just beginning its F-16 program, which was a massive project in itself. Pilots had to be trained from scratch, ground crews had to learn maintenance routines, and the country had to build the support network needed to keep the F-16s flying. Trying to take on two different jet systems at once would have been overwhelming. As Sweden's then Foreign Minister Tobias Billström explained, Ukraine's decision made sense. NATO nations had a much larger pool of F-16s available, which meant easier access to spare parts, replacement aircraft, and training opportunities. Gripens were excellent jets, but they didn't have the same numbers behind them. Ukraine needed something reliable and plentiful, not something that would stretch its resources thin. So, Ukraine politely declined, for the time being. Sweden didn't sulk or take offense. Instead, Stockholm looked for other ways to help, sending weapons, supplies, and aid to strengthen Ukraine's defenses until the timing was right for Gripens to finally join the fight. More than a year passed since Ukraine first turned down Sweden's offer. By now, the country had gotten comfortable with its American F-16, which had been flying since August 2024. What started as a steep learning curve quickly turned into mastery. In fact, by January 2025, one Ukrainian pilot made headlines around the world after breaking a record, shooting down 6 cruise missiles in a single mission. That feat alone showed just how far Ukraine's pilots had come. The training program was complete, the learning phase was over, and suddenly Ukraine was in a position to revisit the Gripen question. This time, the answer wasn't no, it was yes. By September, Ukraine had opened serious talks with its European partners about adding new jets to its growing air force. According to the Kyiv Post, much of the discussion centered on the Eurofighter Typhoon, a powerful, multi-role fighter. But buried within the coverage was a key detail. Defense Minister Rustem Umerov admitted that Sweden's Gripen was also part of the conversation. His words were careful, almost cagey, just like those of his deputy, Havrilyuk. But there was one line that stood out. Umerov said that commitments were in place. That might sound vague, but in diplomatic language, it was huge. Sweden couldn't commit to sending Gripens if Ukraine hadn't agreed to accept them. Which meant only one thing. Ukraine had officially said yes, and the Gripen was on its way. And the timing couldn't have been more symbolic. Just days before Havrilyuk's quiet confirmation, the Gripen itself was making international headlines. On September 26th, European media reported that Russia was once again playing its dangerous game of flying warplanes dangerously close to NATO airspace. This time, it was Lithuania's turn. A formation of 5 Russian aircraft, including 3 MiG-31 interceptors, and Su-30 and an Su-35, approached the Baltic states' skies in what was clearly meant to be both a warning and a provocation. It wasn't the first time Russia had tried this stunt. Earlier in September, a similar group of MiG-31s buzzed Estonian airspace. But in Lithuania, the stakes felt higher. Not only was the Russian formation larger, but the political temperature was hotter. Poland had already laid down a blunt warning. The next Russian jet that actually crosses into NATO territory won't just be shadowed or chased away, it will be shot down. Against this backdrop of Russian brinkmanship, the news that Sweden's Gripens were finally joining Ukraine felt even more significant. These weren't just jets for Ukraine's defense. They were a statement to Moscow and to NATO that the skies of Eastern Europe were about to get a lot more crowded and a lot more dangerous. And here's where things get really interesting. NATO itself seems to have quietly confirmed what everyone suspected. The Gripen isn't just on its way to Ukraine. It's already playing a central role in Europe's skies. When Russia sent its fighters dangerously close to Lithuania, NATO didn't just sit back and watch. It responded. But instead of sending in American F-16s or German Eurofighters, NATO made a very deliberate choice. It scrambled Gripens. These particular jets came from Hungary, which operates them as part of NATO's air policing mission in the Baltics. Their job? Identify Russia's aircraft, make their presence known, and escort the intruders back out of the danger zone. The message couldn't have been clearer. NATO trusts the Gripen enough to put it nose-to-nose with Russian MiGs and Sukhois. If NATO had doubts about the Swedish jet, it could have chosen something else. It didn't. The Gripens flew, the Russians backed down, and the skies over Lithuania remained secure. And now, the very same airframe is about to become part of Ukraine's arsenal, which naturally raises the question, what exactly is Ukraine getting? That part is still shrouded in mystery. Havrilyuk, as usual, refused to spill details. Nobody knows for sure which version of the Gripen is being sent or how many will arrive. But we do know there's already a working relationship between Sweden and Ukraine's Air Force. Back in May, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense confirmed that Saab, the company behind the Gripen, had been helping upgrade some of Ukraine's older Soviet-era aircraft. That kind of partnership likely came with more than just hardware. Training, familiarization, and quiet teaching moments about the Gripen systems almost certainly happened along the way. And the Gripen itself? This isn't just another fighter jet. Saab calls its newest variant, the Gripen E, a game-changer. It was built with the idea of facing off against top-tier opponents, jets like Russia's Su-35 and Su-57. One of its standout features is how it uses artificial intelligence inside the cockpit. Instead of drowning the pilot in scattered data, the Gripen E creates what Saab calls a wide-area display. Think of it as a giant digital window that blends radar readings, threat detection, and tactical information all into one picture, making it easier for pilots to make quick, life-or-death decisions in the chaos of battle. That wide-area display inside the Gripen's cockpit isn't just for show. It's like a command center for the pilot. With a glance and a few quick touches, the pilot can choose weapons, fire them, and even guide them toward their targets, all while coordinating seamlessly with other jets in the squadron. It's teamwork at supersonic speed. But what really makes the Gripen a nightmare for Russia is how it handles one of Moscow's favorite tricks: electronic warfare, or EW. Russia has spent decades building systems designed to jam, confuse, or outright shut down enemy radars and communications. The Gripen was built with this exact threat in mind. It doesn't just resist electronic attacks. It analyzes them in real time, adjusts its defenses automatically, and can even feed that intelligence back to its unit. In simpler terms, Russia tries to jam, the Gripen shrugs it off and keeps flying. And that's just the beginning. The jet isn't limited to defense. It has electronic warfare tools of its own that can disrupt or disable enemy systems. Add to that its weaponry, like the powerful 27mm Mauser cannon, which works with radar guidance to make targeting smoother and faster. And you've got a jet that Russian pilots would rather not cross paths with. Speed only adds to its menace. The Gripen can push past 2,200 kilometers per hour. That's about 1,367 miles per hour, or Mach 1.8. Fast enough to chase, outrun, or dodge, depending on what the moment demands. And when the mission's over, the design allows the jet to be refueled and rearmed in less than 20 minutes. In a war where Russia bombards Ukraine daily with drones and missiles, being able to launch, fight, reload, and get back in the air almost instantly is a massive advantage. But the Gripen isn't just about raw performance. It tells a bigger story. When Sweden first dreamed it up, the country could have simply bought someone else's fighter jets. The F-16s and French Mirages were already proven platforms, easy options for a smaller nation. But Sweden didn't want to rely on another country's permission or supply chain every time it needed to defend its skies. So, in the 1980s, it doubled down on building its own jet. Backed by state funding, Saab engineered the Gripen from scratch, then kept refining it until they had something that could stand alongside and even outmatch many of the world's top fourth-generation fighters. Ukraine, in many ways, has been on a journey much like Sweden's. After 2015, when American military support often felt uncertain and uneven, Ukraine began leaning more heavily on its own defense industry. Bit by bit, it learned that relying too much on others could leave it vulnerable. Just like Sweden once did, Ukraine discovered the value of independence in weapons development. That's why the Gripen isn't just another jet for Ukraine. It's a symbol, a reminder that a nation can take control of its own defense destiny, and in Ukraine's case, a possible game-changer in its fight for sovereignty. So what will Ukraine actually do with the Gripen once it arrives? We already know the jet's technical specs. It's fast, agile, and packed with smart tech. But the real story is how Ukraine can use it against Russia. Military analyst Wes O'Donnell laid this out in a March 2025 article where he argued that the Gripen might even be capable of challenging the F-35, America's most advanced fighter. His point wasn't that the Gripen outguns or outruns everything else, but that it outthinks its rivals. Here's why. Modern air combat isn't about who has the shiniest jet or the biggest missile loadout. It's about information. The side that can see the battlefield first, share data the fastest, and make decisions in the blink of an eye has the edge. In air combat, milliseconds matter. They can be the difference between landing a hit or being blown out of the sky. This is where the Gripen shines. Its advanced detection systems, AI-driven cockpit, and seamless information-sharing capabilities make it one of the most connected jets flying today. In defense, it's agile enough to intercept drones and missiles before they reach their targets, while feeding real-time intelligence to Ukraine's broader air defense network. That means other systems, whether ground-based or in the air, can react faster and more effectively.
If you've made it this far into the video, it means you're enjoying what we do here at Euro Bulletin. Take a second to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more updates and insights from Europe and its partners. Let's dive in more into the subject.
Offensively, the Gripen is just as valuable. Its maneuverability lets it slip past many types of air defense missiles, and its multi-role design means it can strike ground targets just as easily as it can tangle with enemy aircraft. And if Ukraine ever ends up in classic dogfights against Russian jets, the Gripen is more than capable of holding its own. But there's another advantage, one that often gets overlooked: cost. War is expensive, and Ukraine has to watch every dollar it spends on its defense. According to United 24, keeping a Gripen in the air costs roughly $4,000 per hour. Compare that to the F-16, which costs about double, and the savings add up quickly. In a drawn-out conflict where every resource counts, that kind of efficiency could make a big difference. The war in Ukraine isn't just being fought with missiles and tanks. It's being fought with bank accounts, too. The Atlantic Council describes the conflict as a war of attrition, not only on the battlefield, but in the economy. The numbers paint a stark picture. In 2024, Ukraine's military spending, including help from its Western partners, hit about $100 billion. That's half of Ukraine's entire GDP. A third of that came straight out of Kyiv's own budget. Russia, by comparison, spent more, around $170 billion. But that number only ate up about 8% of its far larger economy. Some analysts don't think Ukraine's math adds up. The outlet Responsible Statecraft has argued that Ukraine is overspending on defense in ways it simply can't sustain. Since the invasion began, the country has been running annual deficits of more than 20% above its GDP. For 2025, the projected shortfall is staggering: $41.5 billion. Tax hikes haven't plugged the gap. Foreign aid hasn't erased it. According to the outlet's gloomy forecast, even if the war magically ended tomorrow, Ukraine could still run out of money before the end of 2026. So where does the Gripen fit into this financial storm? No one is claiming it's going to fix Ukraine's economy, but it does help in small, practical ways. Every hour of flight time in a Gripen costs about $4,000 less than in an F-16. That doesn't sound like much on its own, but multiply it across hundreds of sorties, and suddenly you're looking at millions of dollars saved. It's not enough to close the budget gap, but in a fight where every dollar counts, every little helps, becomes more than just a saying. And beyond cost, the Gripen brings other practical advantages. Unlike most fighter jets, it doesn't need massive, carefully maintained runways. Sweden designed it to be rugged, able to take off and land on unconventional surfaces, including regular highways. NATO pilots even practiced these highway maneuvers in 2024. For Ukraine, where military bases are constant targets for Russian missiles, the ability to disperse jets onto civilian roads or hidden strips could be a lifesaver. It means flexibility, it means survivability, and it means Russia will have a much harder time guessing where Ukraine's fighters are going to show up next. One of the Gripen's biggest strengths is its independence from traditional air bases. Because it can launch from highways or other improvised strips, Ukraine won't have to rely solely on large vulnerable runways that Russia loves to target with missile strikes. That flexibility means more chances to keep the jet safe, and more headaches for Russian planners who won't be able to predict where Ukraine's Gripens might pop up next. But the real value of the Gripen isn't in one flashy capability, it's in options. The jet was designed with versatility in mind, able to carry a wide variety of weapons and adapt to different missions quickly. For Ukraine, that means choices. Choices in how to defend against waves of missiles and drones. Choices in how to strike back at Russian positions. Choices that could stretch Russia's already thin resources even further. And Ukraine can feel a little more assured about those choices now. Earlier in 2025, the Gripen saw real combat when Thailand used it during a border clash with Cambodia. While the circumstances were very different from Ukraine's war, the point is clear. This isn't an untested jet. It has been flown in live conflict, and it worked. No, the Gripen isn't going to single-handedly change the course of the war. It's not a magic solution. But its arrival could shift the balance just enough. With Gripens in the air, Ukraine may strengthen its defenses, strike harder at Russian forces, and add yet another layer of pressure on an enemy that is already struggling to hold ground. One possible example? Pokrovsk. The city has become a brutal focal point of the war, with Russian troops suffering enormous losses for almost no meaningful gains. If Ukraine decides to deploy its new Gripens there, the jets could intensify the punishment Russia's forces are already enduring, making a dire situation even worse for Putin's soldiers. So now the stage is set. Ukraine, once cautious about taking on too much at once, has finally said yes to Sweden's Gripen. The jet is fast, flexible, cost-effective, and already trusted by NATO to stare down Russian fighters in the skies over Europe. It won't win the war on its own, but it does give Ukraine something it desperately needs: more choices, more resilience, and more ways to make life harder for Putin's forces. But here's the question. Will those choices be enough? Can a handful of versatile jets tilt the balance in a war that's as much about economics as it is about air superiority? Will the Gripen's arrival mark the start of a new phase in Ukraine's fight? Or will Russia adapt as it always has, finding new ways to strike back? And maybe the biggest question of all, what happens next in the skies over Ukraine?